As 2018 came to a close, activist organizers occupied and held space outside of the Tornillo Youth Detention Center, a glorified prison operated by Baptist Child and Family Services in Tornillo, Texas. Using artful tactics and direct action, activists called attention to the imprisonment of migrant children and the horrific separation of families at the border, while making contact with both imprisoned children and prison workers. Last week, we talked with organizer Elizabeth Vega, co-founder of Artivists St. Louis and founder of Art House, about the situation at Tornillo, the occupation, and the road ahead.
There is this concentration camp in the middle of the desert that's holding 3,000 brown children in an area that is, overwhelmingly brown folks. And so the fight takes on a lot of complexities and layers because we have brown folks that are working in the camp because the area is very impoverished and they're paying living wages and top dollar. And it's isolated, but it's also, smack dab between El Paso and Tornillo. So it seemed like an area that we really needed to really make it a brown-led resistance because there's so much work to be done. And I think also seeing the accumulation of how the system has changed the area, how the border has become militarized and political. I mean, when I was growing up, we would cross over regularly to go to El Paso with, from El Paso to Juarez, no problem at all. There was just a steady flow. The same for Palomas, which is over by where Deming is. There was just movement. People just moved back and forth. Sometimes people from the United States would go to the doctor in Mexico because they could get cheaper meds. Sometimes kids whose parents, were from Mexico but who were American citizens would come and go to U.S. schools, and there was always that free flow. And then, it started to get militarized, and now the entire area is on lockdown. There is no way to go through El Paso unless you go through a checkpoint. Like, you can get into El Paso, but you can't go out unless there's a checkpoint. So what has been happening with the kids in Tornillo is they are often considered the unaccompanied minors. And so, but they define that very loosely. Like, if you have somebody that is coming, say, with an aunt or an uncle or a sibling, they will consider them an unaccompanied minor because they aren't with their parents. And then that would be a reason for them to be in Tornillo. But then what they started doing probably around July or August is these real draconian measures where they were using the children as bait. And so anybody who was in the Tornillo Occupation, the Tornillo concentration camp, when parents tried to claim their child, they would tell them that they needed to fingerprint anybody who was going to have contact with that child. And then they started deporting those who did not have their documentation. And so parents were put in the wrenching position of having to choose between getting their child out of the concentration camp or having family members deported. And so then it also lengthened the process. So some of the kids have been there over 190 days. Some of them are, going on 200 days. And they were only supposed to be there temporarily. And, the camp was supposed to shrink in size. Instead, it's quadrupled.
And with regards to your actions, you set up a water blockade with water jugs, which is, of course, a clear nod to the grotesque practice where Border Patrol destroys water jugs left out for migrants who travel across the desert nearly dying of thirst. Talk about the importance of highlighting the water issue, not just for Tornillo, but beyond.
Well, I mean, I think that the thing is that we are at a place in this country where even the basic necessity of water has become a weapon of oppression. Even that has become militarized in many ways. You know, you have what's happening in Flint, Michigan, where drinking water, you know, folks in Flint, Michigan have contaminated water pipes and are still having to have water bottles shipped in. You have the Standing Rock struggle where people are fighting the pipelines for water, for clean water. You have children that are coming out of the detention, the family detention centers that are dehydrated and parched because they were not given water in these detention centers. We talked to one mother who begged them to give her water because her milk was drying up and they would not give her water. She had to sneak in water so that her milk wouldn't dry up so that she could feed her baby. This is a basic human right. Now, we have heard that water is going to be the next, quote, oil, right? It's going to be the next. I think that we need to get ahead of this right now because it's all connected and it's all rooted in our humanity and seeing one another's humanity and seeing the importance of water as being sacred and how it's linked to the sacredness of our life. And so that's part of the reason why we wanted to do that. People should not be put in prison for giving humanitarian aid and water to people. Mm-hmm. Children should not be held in family detention centers and denied water. We talked to somebody who said that at a detention center in Albuquerque for trans folks, that they were being forced to drink water out of the back of the toilet.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that blockade because it happened during a shift change. Were you able to make contact with any of the workers? You mentioned that a lot of the workers are brown. Were you able to make contact? Was there any sort of response from the workers?
Most of the workers stayed on the bus, but there were some actions that were directed specifically to the workers. And I want to clarify, we had a young activist. She's only like 15, and she went with people and she followed the buses. And she's Black, and she was dismayed when she realized that it was Black and brown folks mostly that were working that town. And and so that ties into poverty issues, mm-hmm. because who are the most economically disadvantaged in this country? Because they're using people of color to oppress other people of color. It's a white supremacy tactic as old as the hills. Mm-hmm. And that's why we need to call it, we need to name it, and we need to understand the interlocking components of these movements. Because if they can pay living wages for a concentration camp, they can pay a living wage every other place.
Was there any sort of contact with the children that were inside?
We had big, giant puppets that popped over the fence, mm-hmm. that could be seen over the fence. We had a professional stilt walker that popped up over the fence. We threw soccer balls up over the fence, and the kids saw us. They would cheer. They would raise their hands. Every time they acknowledged us, the staff would usher them back inside. They did not want people to have contact with them, nor did they want us to have contact with the children. And my thing is if you have nothing to hide, if this is so well run, then why is it behind barbed wire and fencing? And why are you covering the fence with black plastic tarps? We did a lot of different tactics. Like I said, we did resistance around the area. We went around towards the back. We held up banners. We chanted. We had sticks with big ribbons on them that we could hand up. and that were bright and colorful against the sky, joyful, whimsical resistance. We had people from all across the country make 3,000 tissue paper flowers, like help us make 3,000 tissue paper flowers, and the whole encampment has paper flowers all around it, so that we can point to each of those flowers and say, see that? Each one of those flowers represents a child that's in there.
Mm.
Because it's like, how do you show the magnitude of 3,000 children?
Right.
Especially when they're behind barbed wire.
So what's the next steps in terms of, do you have any idea what's going to happen with these kids? Is there just sort of this open-ended, indefinite feel to it?
It has this open-end, indefinite feel to it. They were supposed to close it in I think June or July. Then they were supposed to close it the end of the year. And then they were supposed to close it in January. And now we're hearing June or July again. And I think like what they keep doing is they keep kicking the ball down the road, and people get complacent. We expect them to close the Tornillo camp down and all the detention centers where these families and children are being held, but not in the way that they have been. Experience has taught us that they plan to do it. Like they did in El Paso this past week, where they were dropping hundreds of people off at parks, at bus stations, at other places in the city, and just saying, here, you handle this. You had volunteers that were running, starting and running 24-hour emergency shelters, because they had just released people. Some of them still had their anklet monitors on. No explanation given to them what they were supposed to do with that, with no resources, and saying, find your way to your sponsor.
Mm.
That's cruelty.
Yeah.
And so we want them to be intentional and compassionate and methodical and humane. Part of the accountability is that we, as a country, if we truly say that we believe in humanitarian care, if we pride ourselves in being a supposed leader and, a superpower, then we absolutely need to rise up as people and insist that our government do the right thing. And if that means us going out into the streets and protesting and having a presence at every single detention camp and detention center in this country to do that, that's what we need to do. Because what we saw this past week was just simply unacceptable. And it is a humanitarian crisis, and our complacency is fueling that. And we need a brown-led resistance, particularly at the camp in Tornillo, because of all the issues that are connected, that are manifested in that camp, are a brown and an indigenous struggle. And so we want there to be resistance, and a brown-led resistance. We invite everybody to come, all colors, all backgrounds, but let it be known that it will be a brown-led resistance.
Mm.
And, that brown leadership will be followed, because those are the folks that have been dealing with all of the issues for years, long before the concentration camp at Tornillo showed up. I think we need resistance at every detention center in this country. We need people to show up and be there and insist that our country do the right thing. So if we have an occupation at Tornillo, we have one at Florida, we have another one at the detention centers in Arizona, that every single detention center should have people rising up and say, this will not stand. Because what is happening is a crime, multiple crimes against humanity.
To stay up to date on Tornillo, the occupation, visit their Facebook page at facebook.com/Creative Brown Resistance. Also, to hear the full interview with Elizabeth, check out the Act Out podcast, which comes out every Friday on Libsyn, Stitcher, Spotify, and iTunes.